Three things real quick. There is candy on the windows for all the fathers in here. And if you don't take it, it's all going to melt because the air conditioner goes off as soon as we leave. So, please take some candy. Don't leave it there. I know, fathers, you didn't start your diet today. Okay? Geez, I had three things. My second thing was, this sermon's going to anger you, and I hope it does. Hopefully you still want, who wants to still hear my sermon? I mean, it's probably going to upset you, but
preach on,
that's what
preach
I'm
on.
supposed to do. So, and third, and this is something that angers me. We all caught the news about the shootings in Charleston, and what at a church, and what really breaks me is when I begin to see people line up on either side and begin to argue about, was this racism, was it not, going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and what gets lost are the real people that lost their real lives, and they will never be going home to sit with their families again. Now is the time to grieve and mourn. Please don't go to all the sides and start arguing all the politics, please. There are deep divides in this country, however you want to say it or talk about it. And God wants to restore those things. Okay? Now, once again, oh no, did this blew out? All right, so this is a picture of my father and I. Paul, if you can quit messing around. That's fine. All right, so this is me when I was little. Yes, I was that little. And yes, my father once had that mustache. And I love my father to death. And one of the reasons I love my father to death is because he is a very, very, very funny guy. Even when he's not trying to be funny, he is very funny. I've even told him I would love to rent you out to parties because he is that funny. Now, I love to antagonize my father. And how many sons in here love to antagonize their fathers? Just, yeah, come on, guys. It's such a great time. Love to antagonize my father. He did it to me when I was younger, and so I just returned the favor. The topic of politics is always a hot button issue with my dad. And so if I catch him just right, I can just bring up a very hot button political issue or talk about a certain politician, and I can literally see the adrenaline start pumping in him, and I can see the Incredible Hulk. I can see his eyes. And it's great. Now, I usually on Father's Day or for birthdays, I send him a card with a certain politician's face and a politician that's bringing his greetings. And I know my dad hates it because he doesn't call me for like 3 days. It's wonderful. Now, I've never had a huge interest in politics, and I know how important it is to vote and how important it is to stay up to date on current policies and laws that are being proposed. I know how important it is. However, I just never had this big interest in actually diving into it. What does fascinate me, however, is election time, especially the presidential election. I was once, 2012 in August, I was flipping through the channels on TV, and I came across the Republican National Convention. And as I was flipping through the channels, I just was like, okay, I'll check this out. And if you didn't know, these political conventions, they are the time when political parties officially announce who they are putting up to run for president. And so on this particular evening at the convention, Big Bad Mitt Romney was set to speak. Now, I got nothing against Mitt Romney. He gave a speech, and I really wasn't like enthralled. But it wasn't because I wasn't enthralled, it wasn't because he didn't say anything good, it was because there was something else that caught my attention. And what's interesting is that the same thing that caught my attention at the Republican convention was the same thing that caught my attention at the Democratic convention a few weeks later. At both conventions, by the time both candidates got up to speak, thousands of people in the audience were primed and hyped. They had songs playing 30, 40 minutes ahead of time. And like really patriotic songs. In between the songs were these videos promoting their political party, these very inspirational videos. And I was inspired by some of them. And then it happened. Crowd is hyped. Crowd is pumped. They're pumped. Then I saw it. Both candidates at both conventions walked out onto the stage. And people in the audience stood in awe. Some of them were clapping, some of them were shouting. I mean, they're waving signs. They are fanatical. But then, what really caught my attention is they zoomed in on a couple people, and those couple people were crying. They were crying. And I was very concerned at that moment. I was concerned for our country, I was concerned for our world, and even more, I was concerned for the church. Do you know where those tears came from? Those tears came from a very, very, very specific place. And those tears may have been shed for various reasons, but if we were to get at the core, at the thing underneath the thing, those tears came from the same place where there is this massive groan inside all of us. And it's a groan that has been with humanity since the very beginning. And no matter how hard we try to ignore it or stuff it, that groan is in all of us. And I'm thinking you all felt that groan when you went on Facebook or the news website or you watched the news and you heard about the shooting in Charleston. Something turned inside of you. That groan comes out when we hear about people going into churches, schools, malls, and just opening fire on all sorts of innocent people. That groan comes out when we discover that there are estimates that say every 20 seconds a child within the world dies because they do not have access to clean drinking water. That's a conservative estimate. And you can't say, well, no, there are people who don't have access to what we take for granted every single day. Every 20 seconds, a child dies in the world. And there comes the groan. And we discover that groan also when we find out that most of the men in American prisons, they've done some research. They come from homes, most of them, where a father was absent or abused them or was neglectful. You need to pay attention to that groan. You need to, because we all feel it. And that groan is a cry for something else. One of my heroes, Martin Luther King Jr., said this: "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." This world is filled with injustice. In many places, the world is unjust. And our groans are actually a longing for justice, whether we are aware of it or not. Why? Because our souls are bent towards it. When we talk about justice, we are talking about the world made right. That is what we are longing for. That is what we are groaning for. But not just at a personal level, we are also groaning on behalf of the entire world. Now, when I watch those conventions, when I witnessed people crying, I witnessed people that were longing for justice. The only problem is that in those conventions, my fear was they were placing all of their hopes and longings on these two human beings. And every time a president is elected, there may be all sorts of excitement from either political party, and every time what happens? They let us down. Why? Because they're human. Because they're human. And what I've seen take place in our culture, and among many Christians, is that when we place all of our hopes and longings for justice to be had, for things to be made right, we are essentially, what we are doing, even as a church, we are pointing away from our responsibility and the call that God has placed on the church. Just the other day, as you can tell, I'm very excited about this topic. Just the other day, I was cruising Facebook, and you shouldn't cruise Facebook when you're grumpy, and I came across this picture. Ronald Reagan, this guy, inherited a mess, and instead of whining about it, he fixed it. I have nothing against Ronald Reagan. However, this picture infuriates me. I know that our current president isn't very popular amongst most evangelicals, but this picture infuriates me. Why? Because it was posted by a pastor I know. And I can't tell you the amount of pastors and Christians I've seen post things like this. And I can't tell you the amount of people I've heard complain and argue and fight about politics. Listen, there comes a time when we need to verbally confront injustice and call it what it is. But what we need to realize is that God hasn't just called us to talk. He's called us to act in selfless, restorative, gracious, loving ways. It's not just about being a talking head. My grandfather, man, I loved very dearly. He died in 1998. He used to tell me this when I was younger. He used to say, Michael, if you don't vote when you have the chance, you have no right to complain. Now, I love my grandfather, but if I were to take that statement and twist it and point it back at us, at me, it would be this. If you don't take action, if you aren't willing to take God serious and the call He has placed on each of us, not just Pastor Mike, on the call of each of us, if all we're going to do is cross our arms and yell and whine and complain, we have no right to complain.
Say it again.
Sometimes I believe God's looking at us and says, I've given you everything you need. Resources, talents, gifts, I've given you that. Stop crossing your arms and saying, that person has to fix it. Why aren't you fixing it? The God within the Scriptures is not just a super personal God. He's all about meeting my needs and all my therapeutic needs. The God of the Scriptures is a God of justice. He is a God who wants to set His world right. Why? Because sin and injustice have torn it apart. They've torn people apart. It's killed people. And God doesn't think sin and injustice is funny, and He doesn't think it's cute, and He's not just going to pat us on the head and say, oh, it's all right. One day it's going to be better in heaven. He doesn't think it's funny. He doesn't think it's cute. The God we see in Jesus is going to set things right. And if we want to sit here, and if I myself want to be a pastor, and I want to say, well, I believe and trust in Jesus. If we want to mimic the God that we see in Jesus, we better grasp very quickly that God is not just a God of words, but He is a God of action. If you look at the movement of the Scriptures, you see a God who speaks, and then the Word becomes flesh. When you read the Gospels, what you will discover is that Jesus doesn't really like the status quo. Hates it. He has a tough time with it. Turns it upside down on his head. He's upsetting all sorts of people. In the words of a rock band, he is always rocking the party. When Jesus begins His ministry, you will notice that He wastes very little time. He doesn't have time for nonsense. He just doesn't. He tells it like it is. He has a very vivid, clear mission of what God is doing in this world. And what sets Him apart from every other Jewish rabbi or sage in His day is that He has this enormous disposition and compassion for people that are broken. All the poor, all the outcasts, all the people that we may say, well, they need to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. No. He's got this disposition towards the poor, the broken, the diseased, all the people that have been kept on the outside. And He's not just simply talking about it. He's doing it. He's among them. He's eating with them. He's partying with them. He's putting His hands on them. He's acknowledging them. For some people, He's healing them. He's blessing them. And in these moments, Jesus is doing more than just being a nice guy or performing miracles. Jesus is affirming people's immeasurable worth before the Father. He is affirming their humanity. He's reconnecting them with the love and the life and the blessing that the Father wants to pour out on His kids. Because the real injustice is when people are cut off from the life and the love of the Father, and they are being told otherwise. Now, for early Christians, Jesus is putting flesh and blood on the one He called His Father. And at one point, He makes this very bold declaration. He says, I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. If you have trouble believing based on my words, believe because of the things that I have done. So the question, when people watch what the church is doing, and catch me here, they're still watching. Well, if people watch what the church is doing, and we're not talking about building, we're talking about flesh and blood human beings. When people watch what we, you and I, are doing, are they seeing a people who truly believe in the God of justice? Are they seeing people who take God's call serious? Are they seeing people who take God's call to love and serve and give themselves away? Are they seeing people who are serious? Or are they sitting in church that crosses his arm and argues, points fingers, complains, casts judgment, you fix it, it's your problem? Turn with me to Mark chapter 10, verse 13. Mark chapter 10. Mark 10. Nowhere do I see the love of the Father so clearly than in this story. Mark 10, verse 13. It reads this way. People were bringing little children to Jesus to have him touch and bless them. But the disciples rebuked them, they scolded them, and when Jesus saw this, he was indignant. And he said to them, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. And I tell you the truth, anyone who will not receive the kingdom of God like a little child will never enter it." And he took the children in his arms, and he put his hands on them, and he blessed them. In the first century world of Jesus, children were considered a blessing from God. They were considered a blessing. In Genesis, the tradition from which Jesus comes, God said that the first should be human beings. Fulfill, be fruitful, and multiply. Be fruitful and multiply. Children were a blessing, but to be honest, even though they were considered a blessing, they were also looked upon as weak and defenseless and dependent. Jewish families didn't hate their kids. They didn't neglect their kids. But their kids were dependent on them fully. They were defenseless. They were weak. Outside of first century Israel, children were also on the bottom rung of the social ladder. Even in the Roman Empire, there was one Roman historian who said this: "None among all the animals is so prone to tears." Children were just viewed as insignificant. Among ancient peoples, children were cute and they were innocent. But if you put them next to warriors and heroes and Messiah figures, insignificant. And so Jesus comes to town, and he has been being hailed as Messiah, and people are flocking to him. And it's in this small little setting that parents are bringing their children to him. And instead of playing it off like, "Hey, I don't have time," he takes these little children viewed as insignificant and he blesses them. And I've said this before. He doesn't just round them up and, "I bless you." I would imagine that Jesus took them in his arms one at a time and blessed them with the love of the Father. Now, the text says what? What was Jesus' response to his disciples? Jesus was indignant. Now, if you translate that word into the Greek language in which Mark's gospel was written, it would be the Greek word, aganakteo. Aganakteo. Aganakteo essentially means to be greatly displeased. Okay, translation. Jesus is hot. Jesus is very angry at this point. But it gets even more interesting, because if you would keep tracking in Mark's gospel, Jesus, there's a couple times that he gets really upset. And they use the word indignant. But they use Mark uses a different word. This is a big one. This is like you sneeze. Okay? Splach. Nizomai. Say that with me. Just don't spit on your spouse. Splach. Nizomai. None of you did it because you're afraid to spit. It's okay. Now, splach. Nizomai means to be moved with compassion in one's bowels. This doesn't mean he needs some Pepto. What this does mean is that in Jewish consciousness, the bowels, the gut, was the seat of emotion. It was the seat, the control center from where love and pity came forth. So to the Jews, this is where all emotions came from. And when Jesus witnesses his disciples scold these little kids and keep them away from him, there is this groan inside of Jesus, just the same way you feel the same groan. Why? Because it's injustice. Anytime a person is kept apart or separated from the love and the life and the blessing of the Father in justice. And that's what is happening to these children. And Jesus wouldn't stand for it, and Jesus still doesn't stand for it today. No matter how many excuses we make, I don't have time, I don't have the resources, Jesus still doesn't stand for injustice. Are you angry yet?
No.
Gosh, I hope not. Actually, I hope so. All right, so this is a brother named Orange Scott. And our brothers from the Wesleyan Church back in the day are always very happy people, and they're always very attractive. All right, so Orange Scott is a leader and a pastor in the Methodist Episcopal Church. And the Methodist Episcopal Church was the church that was expanding and growing in America in early 19th century. John Wesley, from where we get the name? All right, my first crowd, it was like one person and they were upset about it. Now, when John Wesley's Jesus movement begins in England, people started calling his group the Methodists, because they were so organized and structured in the way that they practiced their faith. And so Methodism, that's what they're called. And so Methodism begins to pick up steam in America. And even though John Wesley was very outspoken against slavery and the slave trade, the Methodist Episcopal Church in America was also opposed. However, they began to relax their stance. Why? Because slavery was benefiting America's young economy. Not only that, but slavery was benefiting a lot of the people that were in their churches in the South. So if they begin to fight against slavery, well then the people will leave. And our expansion, it will all crumble. So they begin to relax their stance. So for a majority of Americans, for a majority of people that hailed from the Methodist Episcopal Church, they were still against slavery, but they said, hey, let's just do this gradually. Because we don't want the economy to bottom out. And we don't want to upset people. But you know what gradually became? Never. When we get around to it. We don't have time right now to address this. We'll get to it. So Brother Orange Scott, Mr. Happy, a Methodist leader, he begins to rail against slavery. He starts going to the leaders, and he starts going against them and saying, are you kidding me? People are made in the image of God, and we're putting them in slavery. He's at what we would call a district conference with all these pastors and leaders, and the brother just keeps raising his hand. Question, question, question. Orange Scott, would you please stop? He's got lots of questions. Why? Because he wants slavery done. So what they do is they try to silence poor Orange Scott, and they send him to Vermont. Hey, we want you to pastor this little church. 13 or 15 people, have fun. But even though they try to silence him, guess what? His group starts getting a little bigger, and a little bigger. And it spreads to the point where Orange Scott and his group of people say, you either end this now, or we're out. End it now, or we're out. And November 8th, 1842, Scott and these others, there's no progress being made. That's it. They split. Guess what's born? The Wesleyan Church. The Wesleyan Church. It's interesting because as this split was taking place, Scott wrote this. We step into the breach. Duty is ours. Consequences, God's. And so my question is this. Where are we stepping into the breach? Let's get more personal. Where are you stepping into the breach? Mother Teresa, little Mama T, was just over 5 feet tall and weighed about 90 pounds soaking wet. She said this, cannot do great things. We can only do small things with great love. And God doesn't require us to succeed, but He requires us to try. Where are you stepping into the breach? What I don't want today to become is, wow, what an inspiring sermon. And then we walk out. when we leave. Now, I don't believe God is asking us to solve world hunger. I don't believe God is asking us to solve the clean water crisis because, quite frankly, as one person, we cannot do that. Can we fight against it? You bet. But where is God asking us to step into the breach? Now, he's going to hate me, but I'm going to just talk about him real quick. A brother by the name of Bob Strum. Yes, Bob Strum. People look at Bob and they would say, Bob, you are such a rock in your faith. You go to Haiti and you do all this phenomenal work. And yet if you would sit with Bob and you told Bob that to his face and you say, Bob, I could never do that. Bob would say, I'm just a flesh and blood human being who's trying. Pastor Mike, I'm not you. I'm not you. It's probably a good thing you're not me. It's a very good thing. This is a mess. But I'm a flesh and blood human being. And do you know how many times I've failed? And do you know how many people I have offended and I never wanted to, but I did? But all I have said is, God, I just want to try. Do you know how many times I've made a fool of myself? I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just giving it my best shot. Mother Teresa, 5 foot tall, barely, 90 pounds, soaking wet. She's standing among the world's greatest leaders because she has an audience with them. Why? Because she's trying. Because she's trying. So where are we going to step in the breach? Where are you going to step in the breach? Let me give you some suggestions. And these suggestions may seem silly in light of some of the world's biggest problems. However, it's a start. And I want you to hear me. I don't want us to leave and say, wow, great inspirational sermon. Here are some places to step in the breach. This is from your pastor. We need children's workers. We need more youth workers. We need nursery workers. We need people to help with VBS. We need people to help with Celebrate Recovery. We need people to help with Dare to Care. These are the breaches. And you're thinking, man, come on, Mike. Oh, come on. Those are insignificant. You know what? It's got to start somewhere. And I believe that when people start serving and they start meeting Jesus in the other person, they begin to dream dreams, bigger dreams. What if we did this? What if we addressed that? What if we addressed that? They start dreaming impossible dreams. It's got to start somewhere. We need children's workers. We need youth workers. We need adult teachers, small group leaders. Here's the reality. I'm not just going to, my wife and I aren't just going to say, hey, have at it. This is where you want to plug in? Have at it. No. What we really want to do is we want to sit down and train and equip you the best that we can. It's not, hey, go do this, hope you succeed. No. How can we help you serve the best that you can? Where are you going to step in the breach? Are we going to leave and say that was great, or are we going to step into the breach?